Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our coaching, publishing, executive ghostwriting, and podcast production services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. And today, we're being joined by Michael Diettrich-Chastain, author of Changes, the Busy Professional's Guide to Reducing Stress, Accomplishing Goals, and Mastering Adaptability. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Paul. Great to be here with you.
Well, we are thrilled to have you. Are you ready to begin?
Yes, sir.
All right. Question number one. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
I would suggest that they do a good bit of research around differentiating themselves from the market that they currently are in. And so I think, given how many books are published on a weekly or yearly basis, there's a lot of information out there. And so I think one of the most important things to consider is how is our specific book unique? And so really diving into, who's the audience that you want to serve, what else is out there on the topic that you are an expert in, and how might your approach offer a difference that's not currently available?
And what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
From my own experience, one of the hardest parts was deciding which direction to go, self-published versus traditionally published. And part of the reason I say that as an answer is because there's just so much information out there. And so it can be difficult to determine which path to take just because of information overload. And so I would encourage folks to really dive into both options and see what are the advantages and disadvantages, and then cross-check that with the goals that you have for the book, which is really the first question to answer. What do you want the book to do for you? Is it that you want it to make money? Do you want it to be a business building tool? Do you want to give back in some philanthropic way? What's the outcome that you want?
Well, let's talk about marketing. So please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launch that has worked well.
Sure. Yeah, I'll share two strategies that I think worked really well. One was having a really engaged and strategic launch team. And so you can find various information. You probably have some yourself, Paul, around how to build an effective launch team. But I think that really drove the needle for me when I launched. And then the second thing that it continues to deliver is doing podcasting. And so just like this, going on podcasts and doing guest spots and talking about the book and the business and the expertise that I hold. And so those two things are the two marketing pieces that stand out most to me.
So what is your podcast strategy to get on different shows?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was just on one today and I asked that same thing. Initially I had hired a marketing agency to help both kind of look at what options were out there as well as do outreach, and that was mildly successful. To be honest, I've had more success doing the work myself and doing the outreach on my own, maybe with a little help from a virtual assistant. And then in addition to that, at every podcast, asking the question of, if this was valuable for you and for your audience today, is there anybody else in your network that I might connect with? And so I think asking that question, with every guest podcast opportunity continues to, build a trail of breadcrumbs, so to speak.
So what was your strategy to get on the podcast initially? Were you doing Google searches? Were you going through iTunes? What was your strategy to target those specific podcasts that you wanted to be on?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a pretty big podcast nerd anyway. So I have an enormous library of shows that I listen to. And so that I think really helped me. The fact that I'm an avid podcast listener helped put me in a position where I know a lot of them already and have heard so many guests over the years. And so that gave me a starting point of where to research. And, the podcasts that I listen to are ones that are relevant to the industry and expertise that I'm in. And so that was really helpful helpful. And so that's a recommendation I would give people is, consider exploring ones that are relevant to your particular topic or area of interest or industry, and start consuming some of that information. And what you'll learn is you'll obviously learn about the hosts of the shows and the shows themselves, but you'll also learn about the guests, and those guests might have podcasts of their own. So I would start there. And then secondly, the other thing that I did that was really helpful is just reaching out to my network. And I think, in today's age, we're oftentimes in a world where we're connected to people on Facebook or LinkedIn, and we don't even really know them that well. And so there's a ton of opportunity to leverage the current connections that we have, which is exactly what I did. Just started to look at all the connections I have and reach out to those that had podcasts and asking them the same question, who do you know that has a podcast that might be a good fit for me?
So when you initially targeted these podcasts, what was your next step? So you found the shows you want to be on. How were you doing the outreach, and what were you saying in the outreach to be able to get booked?
Yeah, sure. So I had a marketing company create a media sheet for me, which you could absolutely do on your own. But the media sheet just covering a little bit of my bio, some topic areas that I speak on, maybe a couple testimonials, some pictures, a little bit about the book, basically like a page, maybe 2 pages of a media sheet. And so that was a helpful deliverable to be able to give to folks. And then after a few shows, being able to link to my website to say, hey, here's a list of the shows that I've been on, just so that the host can know that, there's a level of experience that's there. In addition to that, again, doing the research on the show specifically, so that when I did reach out, I was able to reference particular, areas in which the host had expertise, or I could reference, specific episodes that I listened to. And one of the things that, I've seen, at least in my experience, that, podcast hosts really like to know that you've listened to their show. And so being able to reference shows that you listen to and specificity about the show seems to be a good strategy.
Well, another thing that I noticed too when we were talking right before we started recording this interview, first thing you mentioned was that one, you enjoyed the show. Secondly, you subscribed to it. And thirdly, you left a review. And that's huge. Mm-hmm. So as a podcast host, one of the main things that for our metrics are we always appreciate anyone that subscribes, and in particular who leaves a review. So I think you, by doing that too, that also endears you even more to that host. So if you're reaching out and going, hey, I love your show, I have subscribed, I just left a 5-star review, this is what I like about it, I've been listening to your shows, all these different things, you're really doing a great job in regards to warming up that host to definitely increase the probability that you'd have the opportunity to be on the show.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're right, and it seems like the level of competition in the podcast arena seems to kind of continue to go up and up as the platform continues to gain popularity. And so I think, the more personalization we can offer as we're doing these various outreaches, the better.
Well, and it's funny. So before I had the podcast, it's probably about 3 years ago, I was reaching out to different podcast hosts. And there's one show, I don't know why I didn't do this, but it was a real goofy move on my behalf. And that was, I reached out to this guy saying, I'd love to be on your show. And here's the problem. He responded going, yeah, I've had 100 episodes and they're all solo casts. And I'm going, oh, I did not do my research. I felt like such a fool. I'm like, okay, I'm never making that mistake again. And that's probably the biggest advice that I can give to people listening is if you want to be on a show like this or a different podcast, do your research. Check and also make sure that they do have guests. When we have people on the show, if they mention they have a podcast, the first thing I ask based on that lesson is, do you mainly do solo casts? Do you bring on guests? Or is it a combination? And just doing that will save you a lot of pain.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great advice, Paul. I totally agree.
Well, speaking of books, I'd like to know what is your favorite book and what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I'll say that the book that it's definitely one of my favorites. I can say that. There's so many favorites out there, but it's one that I've referenced a lot in the teaching that I do and the work that I do with clients in the last few years. And it's Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And the ultimate lesson from that book, in my opinion, is that regardless of circumstance, we have choice in how we respond to that circumstance, which, is a freedom that can't be taken away from us. And so And the story in that book, if folks haven't read it, is worth reading. It's a very powerful and endearing story of a man that goes through some intense pain and suffering, and on the other end comes to this philosophy of, that choice and perspective can't be taken away as our human freedom. And and the author went on to create a career as a psychologist, and then created a particular methodology based on this paradigm that he had created. And so yes, that would be one of my favorites. Absolutely.
And for a final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
Well, given the time that we're in right now, it's a quote that I heard recently. Again, so many favorite quotes, but I heard this one recently, and it really stood out to me. And it's related to this coronavirus. And so, if you're listening to this in the future, I'm sure you can remember the time in which we were in the coronavirus. And the quote was, the person mentioned, we're all going to have to answer to the same question on the other side of this epidemic, which is, how did you show up as a human being in the midst of the coronavirus? And so that quote really has been resonating with me for the last few weeks. And again, I think, it speaks to this opportunity that we have, regardless of circumstance. Again, we get to choose how we show up and how we participate. So yeah, that's one.
Well, and to paraphrase one of the other quotes, I think that really stands out right now too. You really get to find a person's true character in times like this. You really get to separate the phony people from the real people and the people that are all in with you. This is, you really separate yourselves in times like this. And I think that quote that you said is just perfect for that.
Yeah, I love that, Paul. I totally agree.
Well, Michael, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
Sure. The practice that I have, it's a leadership development consultancy, and it's ARC Integrated, arcintegrated.com. And if they're curious to learn more about the book, they can find that at thechangesbook.com.
Well, Michael, thank you once again for being on the show, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Thanks so much, Paul.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how to get your book published with a proven system that works, grab a free copy of my book at getpublishedpodcast.com.